Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of November 2024. And I believe I was able to get through 26, which is kind of lower than what I normally read. I had a visit to see some family for Thanksgiving and didn't read as much as I normally would in the month, but some really good ones on this list. So I'm excited to open up my Goodreads list and let you know what I was able to read in the month of November. The first book I picked up is a book called Foe by Ian Reid. And Ian Reid is also known for a book that was made into a film called I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which a lot of people said was just kind of like confusing to some extent, and like you read it and then you wanted to read it over again. And I would put this book into kind of the same category in that it's basically a futuristic book. It is a little bit about kind of science fiction in that there is a man and a woman who live in this farm and they're kind of set apart. They're rural, and so they don't have a lot of interaction with people. And this man shows up one day and says, you know, you've been kind of entered into a lottery, to the man that's in the house, to go and kind of like colonize this new planet. And it's not for sure that you're gonna go, but we wanna kind of start preparing you. And this starts like a series of visits with this man coming to the house. And I don't wanna give away spoilers. It's kind of hard to describe like how far I can go into the plot with this because I don't want to give too much away. But basically, there are definitely unreliable narrators in the book, and so you're not quite sure what's going on at various given times. I do feel like it wraps up in a way at the end where you understand what happened. You know, in this particular book, I definitely wanted to pick up the other book that this author has read based on my reading of this one, just because I was really intrigued by how he put it together. And so I'll probably be picking up his other book sometime soon. The next book that I read was part of a larger box set called The Lunar Chronicles, and the first book in that series is called Cinder by Marissa Meyer. And I ended up reading the entire box set, which included, I believe, 4 novels and 2 sets of short stories that are kind of interspersed in between the novels. And I actually really liked this. Now, I think I've said before that I'm not always a fan of fairy tale narratives, but this is basically a sci-fi retelling of several different fairy tales. So the first book is, maybe not surprisingly, a retelling of Cinderella. The second book in this series is Scarlet, which is a retelling of Red Riding Hood. The third book in this series is called Cress, which is a retelling of Rapunzel. And then you have Fairest, which is kind of the short story collection that goes between books 3 and 4. Then the fourth book in the series is called Winter, and this is a retelling of Snow White. Then you have Stars Above, which is another short story collection that kind of wraps up the entire series. And what is interesting about this is basically each of the books in this series are interconnected. So you get introduced to a set of characters in book 1 and they travel all the way through the rest of the books. And so what ends up happening is in each book a new character is introduced, and then they're kind of like connected somehow to the previous books and the characters you already know, which I thought was like a really fun way of introducing like new storylines, but also keeping some consistency throughout the series. So I really enjoyed this. I'm actually going to pick up another book by this author, hopefully in December, because I just hadn't read her before and I really enjoyed this. The next book that I picked up is a nonfiction book called Soundtracks: The Surprising Solution to Overthinking by Jon Acuff. And basically, this is a book that is about having more positive self-talk. If you have kind of what he calls soundtracks that you play in your mind that are a little bit more negative or a little bit more kind of like tearing yourself down, how do you kind of shift those soundtracks to kind of pump yourself up or have more confidence? And he gives a lot of different examples throughout this book. It's relatively short, so a pretty quick and easy read. And also Jon Acuff is known for a little bit more of like comedy writing, and so he brings that into the book as well. So I did enjoy this one. The next book I picked up is called Exercised by Daniel Lieberman. The subtitle of this one is Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. And so it's basically about a lot of mythologies around exercise where Daniel Lieberman basically kind of like pokes at certain things that we think we know about exercise and movement, and really asks the question of like, how do we know that, or is that really true? So for example, there is a popular set of books that have looked at a tribe of runners in, I think, South America, and has basically made the argument that they've kind of like evolved to be this like superhuman, running tribe. And he goes and looks at that tribe and he's like, actually they don't run all that much. Like they have a very specific reason why they run. It's kind of culturally specific to their tribe, but it's not like they're out running and training like every single day. Like this is actually not a huge part of their life. And so he kind of digs into some of these kind of narratives that we have around exercise and movement and how it's evolved over time, and tries to get at kind of the root of the history of it. I found this to be really interesting. It is lengthy. I did listen to it on audio and found that to be kind of the easiest way to kind of get through the content because it's somewhat dense and also quite long. The next book that I picked up is one called Folly, and this is the first book in the Folly Island series. I think it's just a duology actually, by Lori R. King. Now, Lori R. King has a couple different series that she writes. This one I consider to be almost a standalone because it has the duology, but it's probably could stand alone based on the content. And it's basically the story of this woman who goes to an island, and it's kind of like a period for her to kind of get, like, rejuvenated is probably too strong of a word, but she's coming out of a period of like depression and challenge, and she wants to go to this island and kind of like wrestle with her demons a little bit. And so it's not necessarily like a positive refresh. It's more just kind of like she needs this alone time to be kind of isolated on this island. And when she's there, she starts to experience different things that give her kind of like an unreliable narrator quality because she's, there's like some paranormal things and like other things that are happening on this island. And we eventually do get kind of a deep kind of historical explanation of like the family of this island and the house on this island and various other things. She's also in the process of like building out a house while she's there. And so it's got this like DIY component that's kind of interesting. Lori R. King does a really nice job of kind of like intricately plotting and doing good character development in her series. And I found this to be true of other books that she's written as well. And so I found this one to be really interesting, and it was very literary, and it was a nice departure, I think, from some of the other stuff that I had just read in terms of the nonfiction. Another nonfiction book that I picked up in the month of November is called How to ADHD. This is an insider's guide to working with your brain, not against it, by Jessica McCabe. Now, Jessica McCabe has a very popular YouTube channel about ADHD. And if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I've been doing a deeper dive into various books on neurodiversity, and this is one of them. This is a very kind of like hands-on and clear guide for people who are kind of just diagnosed with ADHD or trying to figure out what it is that they need to do to kind of navigate through this diagnosis. And the author is, of course, herself someone who has ADHD, and she gives a lot of kind of personal stories and narratives about things that have happened to her in the past, and in particular how she kind of dealt with some of like the shame components of ADHD, of not being able to do certain things or doing them in a different way from other people, and lessons learned, through her various ways of navigating through her own diagnosis. So this was also quite lengthy. I think it's broken up in a very helpful way. It's written for people with ADHD, so it's kind of chunked in a way that holds your attention. And I definitely wanted to go back and watch more of the YouTube videos after I had a chance to read the book. Okay, next I picked up another book in the Sweater Weather series. This is a collection of 7 books, all written by different authors, but have like this interconnecting town that they're all set in. And this one is called A Not So Fictional Fall. It is by Savannah Scott. And basically it is about a romance author who is a man, but he has been masquerading as a female romance author, and he kind of like comes out at this book event as being a man. And in the past, he basically just had like a nom de plume, and he wasn't necessarily in like, he didn't have pictures of himself, and he wasn't giving interviews and things like that. And so nobody knew who he really was. And one of his biggest fans is there at this event, and they end up, for various reasons, entering into a fake marriage trope, which is not my favorite romance trope. I think I've admitted in the past, but I did like to see how their relationship kind of evolved over time. And it was definitely a different lens of looking at this small town from other books, in the series. Okay, the next book I picked up is a book called The Family Game by Catherine Stedman. I loved this book. I thought it was super well plotted. I think I read it in like one sitting. I really, really enjoyed it. So it's basically the story of a woman who is a writer, and she is marrying into this wealthy family. And when she goes to like meet the family, the father-in-law, the future father-in-law, gives her this set of tapes in which he basically confesses to a murder. And she's like, is this for real? Is this not for real? Like, what's going on here? And she basically gets sucked into this like wealthy family who plays all these like very strange games around holidays and around gatherings. And she gets kind of pulled into these games of this family. And I was just turning the pages. I found this to be super fascinating. I've read this author in the past. I've liked her other stuff as well. I feel like this book, I'm just gonna look at the rating. It has like a lower rating than what I would have thought, because I just found it to be super interesting. And I don't know, I really like the twists and turns in this one. And I could see how people might think it's a little bit convoluted, but I really liked it. Next up, I picked up a book called Sunlight, which is the second book in the Haven River Ranch series by Daphne Perry. This is a romance series set on a ranch, and basically is the story of a woman who comes to the ranch to work there, has kind of a one-night stand with one of the brothers who's a co-owner of the ranch, and becomes pregnant with his child, and then they're kind of navigating their relationship from there. I would say that if you are familiar with Daphne Perry, you know, one of the things that she is really good at is kind of character relationships being built over time. And that's really showcased in this book as well. The next book that I picked up is a book called The Future by Naomi Alderman. This is another book that I absolutely loved. Now, you may know Naomi Alderman because she has another book called The Power, which I believe was made into like a film or a show. And this book is kind of a set in the future. So it's kind of a futuristic book that is talking about basic premise. There's 3 billionaires and they're kind of the equivalent of like Meta and Amazon and Google. Like they're the people who run those kinds of companies. And they have this technology where they get advance notice when there's going to be like an apocalyptic thing that could like end the world. And I won't go into all the details of what this technology does because it's kind of fun to learn about it in the book. But that's not a spoiler. That's just kind of the basic premise. And so basically what happens is they get notification that the world is going to go through an apocalyptic thing, and they all take off. And they basically kind of like have this escape valve, you know, where they're going to like disappear and go off into their bunkers and like live through this apocalyptic event. Then there are these 2 female characters who are kind of brought into this narrative through different kind of side doors. They eventually kind of are connected to each other. One of them is like a survivalist, and she does like videos on YouTube about like being a survivalist. And the other one is a woman who was raised by a survivalist and has that background, but she's one of the like executive assistants or like chief of staff for one of the 3 billionaires. And they end up, these 2 women meet and actually have like an affair. They have a relationship with each other that's like kind of on and off throughout the book, but they're connected. And it kind of creates this interesting set of connections based on the other storyline that's happening with these billionaires. It probably sounds a little bit convoluted, similar to this other book that I was talking about, but I really loved it. I also read this basically in one sitting. I found it to be like so smartly written. So this is one that I can also really, really highly recommend. The next book that I read is one called Firefly Lane by Kristen Hanna. It is the first book in a Firefly Lane series, maybe just a duology, which is basically about 2 women who are neighbors when they are children, and then they grow up into adults and kind of branch off into, one of them becomes like a famous like broadcast news anchor, and the other one is a stay-at-home mother who is also doing like, I believe like some writing on the side. And this book is very similar to other Kristen Hanna's, if you're familiar with her books. Like they're very in-depth kind of like emotional relationship studies, often taking place in like very specific time periods or very specific like historical moments. And this one basically goes through like the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, and watch these women kind of like experience history over time together. I really liked this one. I think there are other, I would say further into historical fiction in terms of like being farther back in history. I like Kristen Hanna's books that are a little bit farther back in history versus more contemporary. I feel like she just does them really well, but I did enjoy this one too. Then I read the next couple of books in the Maple Hill series by Hannah Grace. The second book in the series is called Wildfire. The third book in the series is called Daydream. And the second book is taking place in like a summer camp. And basically there are two people who go to college together, a man and a woman, and they have a one-night stand. And then they find out that they're both camp counselors at this summer camp and have to kind of navigate with each other and end up being in a relationship. The third book is about a side character who's in books 1 and book 2 of the series, and he ends up having a relationship. He's a hockey player who ends up having a relationship with kind of like she's a writer, and it's kind of like it's supposed to be like a sports guy and kind of like a nerdy girl, I think. And also there's kind of this flavor in book 3, although it's not explicitly named, that there's neurodivergence of the male character. And the female character has like familiarity with that because of other relationships and kind of family members that she has. And so I would say of the 3 books of this series, the first book is called Icebreaker. I probably liked book 2 the best, although it feels a little bit overwrought because both of the characters are dealing with kind of side issues and situations with their immediate families. And it all gets kind of like sucked into the storyline. And I found myself being a little bit turned off by it, but then also I realized like that's kind of real life. I mean, like it was very, reality of like what people are dealing with when they're in a relationship and they've got this kind of messy stuff going on with their families. So I would say this is not kind of one of my favorite series, but I do feel like it hangs together well in terms of the different characters that she's focusing on in each of the 3 books. The next book that I picked up is one called The Usual Silence by Jenny Milchman, and this is a first book in the Arl Shepherd series. And this is basically a book that has a lot of interesting twists and turns. For a good portion of the book, you have no idea like where it's headed or like what's going on. And basically because you don't have all the puzzle pieces yet, like there's not really a way that you could know kind of where it's going. And the reveal that happens in like the last, I would say like 5%, of the book is pretty satisfying. You come to understand why there's like a child psychologist who's searching for this woman, and we don't exactly know why she's searching for this woman, and that's what we kind of find out, at the tail end of this book. And there's also a child who doesn't speak, and he's basically been diagnosed as autistic, but you kind of question that throughout the book because of other things that are happening. And again, we kind of understand what exactly happened with this child to cause, his being basically like mute. And so it's a little drawn out. I mean, I think it's worth it because of like where it ends up in the end, but it takes a little while to get there. Okay, the next book I picked up is called Fellowship Point. This is by Alice Elliott Dark. I had never read this author before. This is a very like literary fiction. It made me think, maybe it was an actual like Oprah's book club, kind of book, but it made me kind of feel like it had that feel to it of being kind of like a literary fiction book. And it's set in Maine. And one of the things I will say about it is it has real Maine vibes. So if you've ever known anyone from Maine, or if you've spent, time in Maine, or stories about Maine, it has kind of this vibe about kind of like being a little bit rugged, having like people who are very individual. They can be a little bit individualistic. They can be tied to the land. I feel like everybody I know who's come from Maine is kind of very loyal to Maine. Like as a geographical area, they often go back to Maine. Maybe I'm over speaking about this a little bit, but it had a very particular vibe that's hard for me to explain. But when I read it, I was like, yep, this is what I know of Maine. Like this feels very right on. And it's basically the story of 2 80-year-old women, and they have like a past history together. They're good friends. And one of them is a writer, and she's kind of coming to the end of her life and her career and is trying to figure out what to do with kind of her final books. And there's also this like literary agent who gets kind of inserted into the story as well and is trying to help this woman kind of navigate her end of career. And then her best friend who lives in kind of the same general area and who is dealing with kind of the retirement of her husband and her own kind of like aging. And so it's basically just about their relationship and kind of their families and the history that they've experienced. And there is also this kind of connection in with some land that they have been trying to protect and are trying to kind of figure out how to protect this land that is in Maine. So I would say if you are someone who enjoys literary fiction, you would definitely maybe want to pick this up. It's a little bit slower. It's pretty long. And if you enjoy kind of like good character development, that might be one to pick up as well. Okay, next I picked up a book called When Gracie Met the Grump by Mariana Zapata. And this one has in its description that it's basically about a woman who has a superhero like land in her yard, and then they begin to have a relationship. And I was like, is this metaphorical? Like, what does this mean? Nope, it's real. So it's basically about a woman who has a man land in her yard, and he is known as like a superhero that is very kind of like, has mysterious origins. Like, we're not quite sure how this person has the powers that they have, and is one of like 4 people who is known to kind of have these powers and uses them for good, like uses them to rescue people. But when he lands in her yard, something has happened and he's like lost his strength and needs to kind of recover. And what I will say about this book is it's creative. You can tell that the author's having a lot of fun with it, and she's kind of like playing around with some tropes. I will say there's a whole section in the middle that I just thought needed a stronger editorial hand. And where it kind of lands in the end, I mean, it's interesting, it's fine. But I think the author was maybe having a little too much fun in terms of what she was trying to do. And there's like different elements that fall apart a little bit in this particular book. Hard for me to say that because I've loved everything else that this author has done. And I would say I enjoyed this one as well, but I kind of enjoyed it because I knew that it seemed like she was just having a lot of fun with it. Okay. The next book that I read is one called Delicate Escape. This is the second book in the Sparrow Falls Sparrow Falls series by Catherine Cowles. And this is a series that follows a number of adult siblings who came together because they were either adopted or fostered into a family. And in book 1, it is a spin-off of a character who's in another series by Catherine Cowles, who's like a former FBI profiler. And he is in a relationship with one of the siblings. And then in the second book, it is the story of one of the male siblings who is wanting to be in a relationship with a woman who's kind of running away from an abuser. And so she's hiding in this small town where they all live. And we come to understand why, she's hiding and what the past history was of her relationship with this person. And then they develop their relationship over time. This is a series that is still being written. I think there's only 3 books that have come out. I think there's supposed to be a total of 5. And I have enjoyed the first 2, plan to continue to read in this series. Okay, the next book that I picked up is the first book in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. It is called Assassin's Apprentice. And I was able to also get to Royal Assassin, which is the second book in the series. I finished both of those in November. The second book I finished, it was like the last book I read in the month. I had no idea what to expect with this. I have read one Robin Hobb book before, and this was this trilogy that has been kind of recommended to start with when you're kind of entering into this world that she has built. And the other book I had read takes place in this world, but it's kind of like an offshoot. It has to do with kind of like piracy and trade on the sea and boats, and so very kind of different. This book is kind of about court drama. It is the story of a boy who is born of a prince and his mistress. And so he is called, for a large portion of the beginning of the first book, just the bastard, because he doesn't really have a name. And basically he lives with the mother, and then the mother's father, if I'm remembering this right, kind of at the beginning of book 1 says, we don't want him anymore, and gives him back to the castle. It says, like, take this child, like, you were the ones who kind of caused this to happen, you can have him now. And so he just becomes this child, basically, that's living in this castle, and everyone knows he's the son of this prince, but he's not really treated that way, and he is raised by this man who basically is a stable man. Like, he works in the stables, he works with the horses and the animals. It is really hard to say how far to go with this, because like the first 2 books, there's a lot of things that happen. But basically, the thing I can say that doesn't really give anything away is that the boy eventually is trained to be an assassin. And the thing that I found really interesting about books 1 and book 2, and I just started book 3, so I'm like getting into it, I'll read it in this next month, is typically in a trilogy, you have the first book that is just like the world building, You have the second book, which is really just the bridge between books 1 and book 3. And then you have the third book, which is like, a great culmination of like all the things. And so sometimes you can see like a good start with the first book and then kind of a dip with the second book, and then it kind of comes back up. I actually felt like the second book in this series was stronger than the first book, and it kind of builds, in terms of what is going on, and you get more of this kind of like court intrigue and like drama of what's happening in this castle. There's a king who's kind of like elderly and is basically dying. There are all these people who are trying to get the throne, and then you have this assassin who's kind of like in the middle of everything. And so I would highly recommend this. I do consider it high fantasy. So if you are someone who enjoys fantasy, you could definitely pick this up. It also reads a little bit like a YA, so it's relatively easy to follow along. Sometimes with world building and high fantasy, it feels just way over your head and you're not quite sure what's going on. I didn't find that to be true with this particular trilogy. I also read it on audio and it was just lovely. I mean, it was just such an interesting story, and I'm really excited to kind of wrap up that trilogy and see where it goes. The next book that I picked up is one called Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise by Justin Zorn. And this is basically a exploration of how the world has gotten noisier and noisier over time. And it talks about silence in terms of like silent retreats. It talks about silence in terms of like quieting the noise in your head. And it's a very kind of like meditative book in terms of like, it looks at science and like the science of silence, but it also is kind of just navigating through a number of different topics in ways that I found to be like very interesting and also just very like calming. So if that sounds interesting to you, you could pick that one up. And then the last book that I read in the month of November is one called Clarence Manor. It was previously titled Ivy by Devney Perry. And this is basically a book about 3 girls who are in college and they live in the same house. One of them is very wealthy and kind of owns the house. And then she has these other 2 girls who have come in to be kind of her roommates. And the woman girl who kind of owns the house is a pretty nasty character. I mean, like she is very manipulative. She lies about things. And basically each of these 3 women have like these different romantic relationships that are all intertwined, and they all have to come to kind of like a grudging respect, I guess, for each other in terms of like how they're interacting with each other. There are several mysteries that are kind of woven throughout this book, and they're all revealed, by the end of the book. But this was one of those books where it's very kind of twisty. And so if you're looking for something that's kind of immersive, where you want to kind of read a story where you can kind of just like dig into it and follow along with like a pretty intricate plot, in terms of how all these things come together in the end, this might be a book that you would enjoy to pick up. So those are all of the books that I read in the month of November 2024, and I hope you'll stay tuned for my December TBR video, where I'm going to talk about all of the books I hope to read in the upcoming month. And until then, happy reading.